We're now ready to look at Part E, the ear of Unit 13, the senses. You may have noticed that when I introduced you to the other parts of the senses, I referred to them by the modality, that is, vision, pain, taste, and so forth. But for this organ, I refer to it by the name of the organ itself, the ear. That's because it has more than one function. We'll look at the two functions of the ear, we'll look at the anatomy of the ear, and we'll discuss hearing and equilibrium. As we said, the ear has two functions, hearing and equilibrium. Most of the ear is located within the temporal bone. Here's an exploded view of the ear. It has three parts. There's the external ear, consisting of the auricle or pinna. That's the flap on the outside of your head. And the external auditory canal, or meatus. That's the hole into your head. The middle ear contains three ear ossicles, or bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes. That is the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, because they roughly look like those. The inner ear is a little more complex, so I've separated the various parts. Keep in mind, it doesn't really look like that. The middle ear includes the tympanic membrane, that's the eardrum, the ear ossicles, as we mentioned, which are suspended by tiny muscles and ligaments. The muscles are the tensor tympani and stapedius muscles. The auditory canal, also called the Eustacian tube, is an extension from the middle ear to the pharynx, your throat. The oval window is a membrane attaching the stapes and joining the cochlea. The round window is a membrane joining the cochlea. By the way, the Eustacian tube allows air to pass between the middle ear and the throat. And since it's often filled with mucus, your ear may pop once in a while when you change altitude because the pressure outside of the body changes compared to inside the middle ear. What about the inner ear? Well, first of all, it's arranged into two irregular chambers. A chamber is called a labyrinth, one inside the other. Bony or osseous labyrinth is a chamber within the temporal bone, and it's lined by periosteum, and it's filled with perilymph, a watery fluid. Inside of that is the membranous labyrinth. This fits inside the bony labyrinth. It's filled with another watery fluid called endolymph. Now, this is a little difficult to imagine. Imagine this. Let's say you have a bucket of plaster of Paris. It's liquid. You put your hand in a rubber glove and stick your hand down into the plaster of Paris. Let the plaster of Paris harden. Now, if you're able to wiggle your hand out with the rubber glove, what's left inside the plaster of Paris is a cavity shaped like your hand. That corresponds to the bony labyrinth. On the other hand, what if you were able to slip your hand out but leave the rubber glove inside the plaster of Paris? The rubber glove would correspond to the membranous labyrinth. The inner ear has three subdivisions. The vestibule, composed of a saccule and utricle. Semicircular canals, three circular canals arranged at right angles, involved in equilibrium. Both are supplied by the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now, you remember when we named the cranial nerves, we talked about the auditory nerve. Well, we did because it fit the poem that we went over, all the limpets and so forth. Properly, that nerve is called the vestibulocochlear because it supplies the vestibule and the cochlea. The cochlea is a coiled structure of three chambers. It's involved in hearing. It's supplied by the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Sound consists of vibrations, waves. The frequency is in cycles per second, which is hertz, and that gives the pitch. Audible range is roughly 20 to 20,000 hertz. Humans can hear a range roughly 500 to 5,000, at least best. The force of vibration, the loudness, is measured in decibels. The ear can detect a 1 decibel difference in sound intensity. It ranges from 0 to 120 decibels. For example, 15 decibels is about what you'd hear with wind blowing through a pile of leaves. 45 decibels is roughly normal conversation. 120 decibels actually would cause pain. The cochlea is a coiled structure in the inner ear, as we said, involved in hearing. Remember, there's an oval window and a round window. A cross-section of the cochlea shows 3 chambers. The 3 chambers stretch through the cochlea. To make it a little easier to understand, let's uncoil the cochlea and stretch it out straight. The upper chamber in the cochlea is called the scala vestibuli. It contains perilymph. It faces the oval window. The lower chamber is called the scala tympani. It also contains perilymph, and it faces the round window. The middle chamber is the cochlear duct. It's filled with endolymph having a high potassium concentration. It contains the tectoral membrane. The organ of Corti, also called the spiral organ because in reality the cochlea is coiled into a spiral, contains hair cells. These are actual receptors. It's bounded by the basilar membrane underneath and the vestibular membrane above it. Sound waves travel this pathway. Sound waves are compression traveling through a medium, air, waste, water, or solid. By the way, notice in empty space, sound waves don't exist because there's no substance that can transmit the waves. So when you look at Star Trek and you see the spaceship rumbling along through space, no, that's wrong. It makes no sound. In the ear, sound waves travel in order through air in the external ear, through the tympanic membrane, which vibrates. This causes the ear ossicles to vibrate, and then the oval window vibrates. The vibration is magnified due to the difference in membrane sizes. The waves then travel through the fluids of the cochlea. Sound waves cause the following. In the cochlea, the basilar and vestibular membranes vibrate. The tectorial membrane remains stationary. The waves of compression cause the cilia on the hair cells of the spiral organ to bend. Since fluids do not compress, and by fluids we mean liquids, each time the oval window vibrates inward, the round window vibrates outward. 2 types of hair cells are the outer hair cells, OHC, and the inner hair cells, IHC. Both have modified cilia called stereocilia. These are not true cilia, but extensions of the cells. The outer hair cells modulate the sensitivity to hearing. The inner hair cells function in hearing. The stereocilia. The height of the inner hair cell stereocilia range from short to tall with mechanogated potassium channels at the tip. The potassium channels are linked by a protein thread to the next stereocilium. This looks almost like someone made it in a factory. When the stereocilia bend, the potassium channels open, and excess potassium flows from the hair cells from high to low concentration. Remember, the cochlea contains a high potassium concentration. The graded potential, which results, stimulates the release of a neurotransmitter, and it causes the first-order neuron to generate a graded potential. If it reaches threshold, the graded potential is transformed into an action potential. The auditory pathway from the ear to the brain involves the following. First-order neurons in the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. They travel to the cochlear nuclei of the medulla, to the superior olivary nuclei in the pons, either on the same side or the opposite side. Second-order neurons arise in those structures, and the neurons travel through the inferior colliculi in the midbrain to the thalamus. The third-order neurons travel from the medial geniculate nucleus to the thalamus of the thalamus to the primary auditory area. The vestibular apparatus includes the vestibule that contains endolymph and a macula composed of hair cells containing a kinocilium, a true cilium, as well as stereocilia, and it's surrounded by a gelatinous mass containing otoliths of calcium carbonate, literally teensy-weensy bones. The semicircular canals are similar, except they consist of 3 circular tubes arranged at right angles to one another. It contains an endolymph. It also has a cupula, a raised part, containing hair cells with, again, kinocilia and stereocilia. It's composed of a gelatinous material, so its construction is rather like the vestibule. The cilia project into the cupula. Static equilibrium is a position sense. It's also involved in linear acceleration. It involves the vestibule, the utricle, and the saccule. When position changes, the macula, with its gelatinous mass containing hair cells and otoliths, shifts ever so slightly. The cilia bend. The graded potential is generated, and a nerve impulse is generated if threshold is reached. The impulses are transmitted along the neurons in the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. So, if you tilt your head sideways, the cilia bend slightly in one direction, informing your consciousness that your head is tilted sideways. If you tilt it the other way, the cilia bend in the opposite direction, informing you that you've changed your position. It's interesting that other animals also have the balance organ. It seems to be very common all the way from jellyfish up to humans. Shrimp, for example, have a balance organ. It's located in their outer skeleton, their exoskeleton, and instead of otoliths, they have a grain of sand in the balance organ. Now, as the shrimp grows, they shed their old skeleton and grow a new one. But in this process, they have to find a new grain of sand and put it in the developing balance organ. So, in effect, they pick up a grain of sand and stick it in their ear. Not exactly. A researcher once wanted to try an experiment, so he raised shrimp in a tank with iron filings instead of sand. So when the shrimp grew and molted and grew a new exoskeleton, it picked up an iron filing and stuck it in its ear, so to speak. When the researcher held a magnet over the shrimp's head, the shrimp immediately turned upside down. Why? Because the magnet pulled the iron filing to the top of the balance organ. That informed the shrimp that it was upside down, and to correct that, it turned upside down. Dynamic or kinetic equilibrium is a motion sense, particularly for rotational acceleration. It involves the semicircular canals. When motion changes, the endolymph circulates, the cupula with gelatinous mass and cilia bend, and a graded potential results. A nerve impulse is generated if the graded potential reaches threshold. The impulses are transmitted along the neurons in the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. You remember when you were a kid, you used to spin around and round, and when you stopped, you were dizzy, you almost fell down, and you laughed and giggled. That's because when you stopped, the fluid in your semicircular canals continued to circulate a little bit, bending the cilia and informing you that you were still rotating. And to compensate for that, it made you feel dizzy. Let's look at the neuron pathway for equilibrium. Nerve impulses travel from the ear to the brain through the following. First order neurons in the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve travel to the vestibular nuclei in the medulla and pons. Second order neurons continue through several pathways to the ventral posterior nucleus in the thalamus, and the third order neurons travel from the thalamus, the ventral posterior nucleus, to the vestibular area of the cerebral cortex. And that's the end of senses. You're now ready to progress to Unit 14, the endocrine system.